Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'd like to talk about wealth inequality and the problem of wealth inequality, and even more particularly, how do we handle conversations about wealth inequality? I think a large focus of my channel at this point, my podcast and my writing, has been to focus on bridging the gap between our popular conversations about things and a sophisticated, nuanced approach to the truth. Again, if anything was the rallying call of my channel, it was that the truth is oftentimes more subtle and nuanced than we care to think it is. That it's very difficult to discern what is true in most cases. And so with respect to that, I'd like to talk about wealth inequality. It's a huge problem in our culture right now. It's a massive debate. And I'd like to gear our conversation today, or my comments about wealth inequality, towards conversations that I think we often have at the popular level when these issues are brought up. And in order to do that, I'm going to take a look at a particular Instagram post made by a content creator out of Australia named Jack Toohey. And I'm going to use his claims, his post about wealth inequality, as an example for the kind of rhetoric that I think we see all the time in discussions about this kind of issue. And my appeal in this video today is going to be for all of you that I ultimately, I'd like to point us to what I think is a better way to have these conversations with one another about all kinds of issues, including wealth inequality, aiming for peace, charity, and education. I mean, I know that sounds so weird to talk about in our culture today, but I think these conversations, these sorts of issues, are so divisive in our culture right now. And I think there are enough voices out there, honestly, that are polemical and overextended in their confidence on a certain kind of position on all sides of an issue. And I would like to offer people a middle way, what the medievals called the via media, a middle way between, it's not centrism. I'm not advocating that our opinion of the truth become some kind of middle road between two extremes. That's not what I'm saying. But I do want to today appeal to you all that the way in which we have our disagreements about truth can be through a middle way. And so that's going to be my appeal today. I'm going to use Jack Toohey's post on Instagram as a medium by which we can have these conversations and highlight some of the issues I think that often goes on when conversations, particularly over social media, happen on political issues or economic issues or social issues like wealth inequality. Okay, I'm going to set up the video a bit, but before I do that, I just want us to have at least an idea of what I'm talking about when I reference this, who's Jack Toohey, etc., etc. Now, as I already mentioned, I'll just say a couple words about Jack Toohey. Jack is an Australian content creator, primarily, I think, on TikTok. He's often sort of introduced as a TikTok influencer. I only know him through Instagram. I'm not on TikTok, but I have interacted with his content before on Instagram, and he has a particular focus. I would say his channel is sharply focused on the real estate crisis or the real estate market, just broadly speaking, and issues of economic disparities or the differences. And in particular, I think this is what I love about his channel is the difference of reality, or the different economic fabric that generations find themselves in. So the intergenerational differences of wealth and economics. And by that I mean his channel is a great tool for educating people on how different the world is today economically from the 1980s and the 1970s, even the 1990s. And before I go any further on I'm going to show you Jack's content in a second that we're going to focus on today. But before I go any further, I just want to say unequivocally, this is not an attack on Jack Toohey. This is not a personal criticism on him in any way, shape, or form. I like Jack's content. I'll just be frank about it. I follow Jack. and I like his content. And I see a lot of good in what he's doing. I disagree with him pretty fundamentally on a lot of things. I'm sure Jack and I probably wouldn't get along personally, but I think all of that aside, I think his channel does great work. And I'd like to say that I think we should try to avoid as much as possible these false antinomies or these false dichotomies between somebody being all good and all bad. Like somebody's content, especially in the social media space, I think at a popular level, we just love to fall back into these ideas that somebody is either totally on our side or totally against us. They're either a complete Marxian libtard idiot who doesn't know anything and is completely lost to the world, or they're a complete, perfect, free market, anarcho-capitalist, conservative, whatever your paradigm is for good, or vice versa. Like if you're coming from the left, it's like, they're either completely right on everything or they're completely wrong on everything. And that is a false dichotomy I think we really have to be cognizant not to engage in, especially on social media where algorithms reinforce what we consume, right? So with respect to Jack, I'll say I think there's a lot of good in his content. I think he's great at educating people on those intergenerational differences. In particular, I think a lot of boomers and a lot of Gen X people just don't understand. They don't fully grasp the differences between wealth generation in their day when they were growing up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s from today. I mean, it is a radically different market. So appeals back to, here's what I did, wealth generation process, younger generations just don't understand that, are not only naive, they're just flatly wrong. They're bad ways of appealing to younger generations. And I think Jack does a great job at highlighting that, of showing through solid evidence, through solid data, there are huge differences for a late millennial or Gen Z person entering the labor force now with the real estate market that they're facing, and a boomer who was buying a house, or a Gen Xer who was buying a house in the 1980s or the mid-1980s. And so I think he's great on that. And I think we have a lot of areas of agreement. I'm going to address some of those later on towards the end of the podcast. But all that being said, I do think we have some pretty significant differences. And I nevertheless think that Jack is wrong. I think he uses fallacious reasoning. And out of fallacious reasoning, he draws false conclusions. Conclusions I strongly disagree with. But I still think it's possible to talk about those disagreements in a respectful way, even if I don't know Jack personally. I don't know if he would. I sort of suspect he wouldn't have a respectful conversation with somebody who truly disagrees with him. I think both in his presentation of this issue, particularly the wealth inequality issue, as well as from what I can see with his interactions with sincere, genuine questions from his audience, I don't think he's got a very respectful, peaceful approach to the issue. Nevertheless, I still think it's possible from my side and from anybody who wants to model conversations that are actually aimed towards the truth and aimed towards convincing people of the truth. I think it's still possible to discuss the problems that we have, the disagreements we have, in a respectful, peaceful, and charitable way. And so before I go any further on just like a preliminary, let me just show everybody, for those of you who are watching on my YouTube channel, you can see, I'll just throw up the post in question that I saw, which he posted earlier this week. I'm recording this as a Thursday. I think he posted it on Tuesday of this week. And yeah, let me just show you all that. So if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see a screenshot of his post. And basically the post, what it is a slideshow. It's not a video or a photo. It's really just a slideshow of, these slides that Jack Toohey very, artistically created to help people understand statistics that he's citing. And the first one that he opens up with is the statistic, which I'll read for everybody who's just listening. The world's 5 richest men doubled their wealth since 2020. And then he's got a graphic showing how in quarter one of 2020, The cumulative wealth of the 5 richest men on the planet was $405 billion. And as of Q4 of 2023, in real terms, this is adjusted for inflation, the cumulative wealth of the 5 richest men on the planet is $869 billion. That is a real growth of 114% in just 3 years. Okay, pretty extraordinary growth of wealth. So that is the original post. That's just the image that he posted up, and then there are other slides with that are similar in nature that cite other statistics. And before I get to those, I just want to point out, especially for all of those that are watching, you can see, hopefully you can see sort of at the bottom of that image, there is a source. The source that Jack is using for all of these statistics, the only source that he's using for this post, is Inequality Incorporated, quote unquote, which is a report released by an organization called Oxfam earlier this week on the 15th of this month. So that is where he's just really sort of regurgitating the statistics from that report. I'm going to cover that report in greater detail and the organization that produced it as it's relevant. I don't know how deeply I'll go into these kinds of things because I'm not sure it's going to be necessarily really. I don't know if it's going to be that necessary to dive into the weeds of everything to make the point that I want to make today. So I'm not trying to make an absolutely comprehensive video overviewing the wealth inequality problem. I simply want to overview one instance of somebody discussing this problem at a popular level, namely via social media, and use that, which I think is a representative example of how we often go about these debates and the kinds of reasoning people often use in issues like wealth inequality and particularly wealth inequality, and sort of point to a better way of doing that. So before I get to the other claims that Jack makes in his post, and well, actually, before I even get there, let me just show you as well. So he opens up this post with that image that I just showed you, and then he actually captions his slideshow with all these statistics with a very specific claim. Okay, and I'm going to break it down in a second, but here's the claim that Jack Toohey, and that's an image of Jack, this is what he hopes to demonstrate to people on Instagram by showing these statistics, by showing this slideshow. Quote, billionaires can only exist through exploitation. Billionaires can only exist through exploitation. Exploitation of workers, exploitation of systems, exploitation of land and resources, exploitation of you, hashtag tax the rich, close quote. Okay. So again, I think it's pretty clear just from his opening statement where Jack Toohey not only stands on how to interpret these statistics, but what he's hoping to demonstrate through these statistics. That is, his opinion of wealth inequality is that it is a horrible evil that is best explained through individual or cartelian type greed, right? So maybe there's a cabal of rich people that are deliberately and intentionally exploiting the masses in order to get billions of dollars of wealth, and that is the cause of wealth inequality. That will become very critical later on in our analysis of this. So other claims that, before I get into just analyzing what he's saying, other claims that he includes in his post would be number one, 5 billion people. So contrasting the 5 richest men on the planet, 5 billion people lost wealth in the period of Q1 of 2020 through the end of Q4 of 2023. Number two, every year billionaires add $1 trillion to their wealth. So again, as a corporate body, the billionaires of the world add $1 trillion to the wealth every year on average. Number three, corporate tax rates have fallen around the world over that same time period. Number four, $1 trillion of profits were shifted to international tax havens. Okay, it's not exactly clear. I just think from that statistic what he's referencing, but because I've done a little bit of investigation on the actual document Inequality Incorporated, produced by Oxfam, what that means is, again, billionaires as a corporate body globally are shifting their assets out of their countries into international, basically countries that have less restrictive tax law and allow for people to shelter their profits. So, and this is actually even at a corporate level. So companies are shifting their corporate profits to tax havens. And then finally, number 5, or really number 6, but the 6th claim that he uses is the richest, the richest 1% own almost half of the world's assets. In specifically, 43% of the world's financial assets are owned by the richest 1% of the world's population. Okay, so that is, in a nutshell, the post. I mean, I'm not going to show you all the slides, but those are all the claims that he makes in his post, and he actually concludes his post. He concludes the slideshow with another claim or explanation, or really the conclusion, again, that I think he wants all of us to draw from these statistics. And he says this, quote, "So the next time you're told you can't have better healthcare, education, public housing, infrastructure, food security, equality, remember that it's because the 1% stole it from you." Emphasis is in his original. So, okay, that is the post, again, that Jack Toohey published earlier this week. Again, I just want to reiterate, I'm going to use this post as, I think, a representative example of the kind of reasoning that goes on social media and in other places for people who want to discuss wealth inequality and find this kind of reasoning persuasive. I think this is very common. It's not an attack on Jack Toohey. It's not personal criticism. I think we could try to just. I think we should just look at it honestly. So here's the question. Having now seen the claims that Jack's making, which I, again, think are representative, what can we discern from Jack? What can we discern from these statistics? What can we discern from his post? And the first thing I want to say is that there's a really bad inference here. This is an inferential argument, and it's really bad. And the inference is from statistics, here are some statistics about wealth inequality, to specific claims about the nature, cause, and then ultimately concluding in a solution to that problem without a warrant. So what do I mean? What is a warrant? In debate, philosophy, rhetoric, and logic, we talk about warrants in argumentation, right? So this is why it would be very, very valuable for public and private schools to resurrect debate education for all students. It would be really, really important. This used to be the importance of a public speaking class. You used to be able to learn this kind of stuff because it's basic logic and basic rhetoric, but I think it's totally gone now. I know almost nobody my age who can give me a definition of what a warrant is. So a warrant in rhetoric, debate, logic, etc., you can think of it as the bridge in an argument, the bridge between evidence and a claim, right? So like if I had a debate on wealth inequality and my claim was wealth inequality is caused by billionaires, okay? Or wealth inequality is a result of billionaires' individual greed. That would be a claim. And then I cited a bunch of statistics as evidence for that claim, like, well, billionaires are growing their wealth at $1 trillion a year. Okay, that's great. I've offered a claim and I've offered some purported evidence for that claim, but now I need a warrant, which is like a justification of how that evidence supports my claim. And that's called a warrant. So what we have here, I'm arguing, in Jack Toohey's post is that we have a really bad inference. We just have a properly bad argument, a properly fallacious inference, an inference from statistics to a specific claim, and not only one claim, but a set of claims about the nature, cause, and solution of the problem he is identifying. So I want to say, and I meant to say this at the beginning actually, but one of the things that I wanted to do to set up this video is to just talk about that identification of a problem is not identification of a solution. In fact, the way I like to phrase it when I talk about these kinds of things is, again, like, you can be right. Go back to that all good, all bad false dichotomy I was talking about earlier. You can be right about a lot of problems the economy is facing. In fact, I think liberals are right about a lot of, even leftists, even Marxists are right about a lot of the problems that the economy is facing. And we can have respectful disagreement over the causes and solutions to those problems. It is not enough to simply identify what seems like a problem, like inequality. It's not enough to simply show evidence that inequality exists. The argument from the other side, liberals, hear me, the disagreement from the other side is not that inequality doesn't exist. So trying to establish the existence of quote-unquote inequality is not going to move the debate any further. And what's worse is that it doesn't establish what you're trying to prove, because what you're trying to prove, what somebody like Jack Toohey is trying to prove, is not that simply inequality exists, but that it's caused by individual greed, perpetuated by a system, presumably or presumptively about a system of capitalistic thought or open capitalist societies. It's causing that inequality, and the solution to that inequality is greater government regulation and involvement. How do I know that? Well, because I've actually read the Oxfam document, and that's specifically what they cite as their solution: further government oversight and regulation. And we're going to get into that, the specific solution that Toohey and Oxfam advocate for. But I just want this point to really sink in, because this is where I think right from the beginning we have problems in reasoning in our popular conversations over wealth inequality. And if the problem starts here and the conversations veer off in a direction without addressing those fallacious reasonings, the fallacious basis for which the conversation is now built on, the rest of the conversation isn't going to matter. If you can't even begin to identify, okay, well, great, you've cited a bunch of statistics that seem very persuasive to people, except you haven't given me any reason to suggest why any of this is being caused by individual greed, or that it's even a problem. Again, have we even established, can we discern purely from the statistics that Jack Toohey is offering that we even have a problem? What do I mean by that? I've argued elsewhere, I think I've argued this even in my published writings on my Substack, but I often argue with people that the issue is not wealth inequality. The issue is, or the problem is probably more likely social mobility. What do I mean by that? I mean, by social mobility, I mean the ability of people in different socioeconomic classes to move around in those classes, from really rich people to move down to less rich castes of society, quote unquote, and really poor people to improve their lot and become richer over time. And there's debate about that. Like, conceivably, social mobility should be able to happen within somebody's lifetime, not just merely generations later or something like that, because it'd be really hard to measure in any particular point of time whether society is really free. If it takes 100 generations for my great grandchildren to become wealthier. Here's an example I often use to help people understand the difference between social mobility and wealth inequality. It's a thought experiment I developed when I was in undergraduate studying economics, and I often explained it to my peers this way, and I find most people find this thought experiment pretty compelling, pretty persuasive as what's the real problem we're talking about. Imagine that we represented the world economy in a classroom. You had a classroom of 100 people, okay, just a room of 100 people, And everybody, enters this room, and life is basically 2 days. You live for 2 days, and you are forced, or you're faced with a number of different decisions. You can either work for no days, in other words, don't pursue any kind of economic activity to build your wealth, etc. You can work for 1 day, either the first day or the second day, in trying to improve your ability, or you can work for the first, or you can work both days, meaning you're going to be in this room for 2 days. 1 day, you're going to come in, you're going to work, and then the next day, you're still going to work, and then you're going to leave, right? This is very similar to the kinds of economic models we talk about in macroeconomics. When we model human behavior and how we allocate resources, because most people spend money that they anticipate having in the future, and they usually save money for people coming behind them, etc. Right? So just don't worry about any of those particulars, but imagine you're in this room, and it's got 100 people, and then on day one, you walk in, the world is already operating, there's distribution of income, quote unquote, distribution of income all over the place, and you walk into the room, and you're one of the 100 people, and I tell you that of all 100 people, out of all 100 people, the total wealth in the room is $1 billion and 1,000, right? $1 billion, $1,000. And one person, just one, out of all 100 people, has $1 billion. They control $1 billion of wealth in this room. And the remaining $1,000 of wealth is spread unequally between the remaining 99 people. So some people have nothing, some people have $100, some people have $500. Even one person has $500, and then the remaining $500 is spread out unequally between the remaining 98 people. If I were to ask you at that point whether you felt like there was a social stability problem, meaning that the vast amount of inequality was a real issue in that world, most people at that point will say yes, right? That is a destabilizing amount of inequality. You cannot have a functioning, peaceful society when one person like that controls everything, right? It's such a supreme imbalance of power, right? This is how most people think. But then, if I told you next that if you followed a set of simple rules, here's how you earn money. You push this button for a day, or don't violently attack somebody else in the room, and so that you don't end up in prison, or etc. Right? Let's say there was a handful of logical rules, just basic, easy to follow instructions that you had to follow in order to gain money in this world, and that if you follow them to the best of your ability, you can be worth $1 billion tomorrow. Would anybody still think that the sheer fact that on day one person controls 99.9999999% of the wealth in the world, would that be a problem? If tomorrow you could own just as much wealth, if tomorrow the total amount of wealth in the room was $2 billion, and you owned $1 billion, and the guy who currently owns $1 billion died and left $500 million to somebody else, and they start distributing, etc., etc., would that still be a problem? What if tomorrow you and 4 other people all had $1 billion of wealth, and that the total wealth of the room had gone from $1 billion to $6 billion, and now it's owned by 5 people out of 100, etc.? And what if we replicated that on and on and on again until you had a room of 100 people, and half of them were billionaires, and one of them was now like a trillionaire or whatever? I think most people at that point start to say, in fact, I haven't found anybody who doesn't find that persuasive, right? Because social mobility exists in that world. It's very easy for somebody to create wealth in that world. Now, just to be very clear, this is a simple thought experiment inside economics to prove a little point. I'm not suggesting that the world works that way. Okay? Here's what I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing that model is representative of the real world. I'm just using that to highlight the difference between wealth inequality and social mobility, because wealth inequality in and of itself doesn't even establish a problem. Because if there's great social mobility and somebody who's rich today can be poor tomorrow, then they don't have that much control over a political situation or the world, etc. And if somebody who's really poor today is free to become very wealthy tomorrow, then it's not really that big of a problem that they're poor today. As long as they're able, without interference and obstacles, to create wealth tomorrow. Now, obviously, the implicit claim of somebody like Jack Toohey is that there are obstacles that prevent somebody from becoming wealthy. I get that, but I'm just pointing out the distinction between wealth inequality and social mobility, and more importantly, that nothing that Jack Toohey cited, and nothing remarkably in the Inequality Incorporated document that Oxfam published earlier this week has anything to say about social mobility. That should be pretty remarkable to people. In a debate that's so clearly affected by ideas of social mobility, can we really have a meaningful debate if all you're doing is citing evidence that there is wealth inequality in the world? And by wealth inequality, we really just mean differences in wealth. Okay, and I'm gonna get to that in a second. So you can certainly argue that the real world works in such a way that people don't have social mobility. I would argue that. I would make that argument for very different reasons than I think Jack Toohey would make that argument. But you have to make that argument. You can't just cite statistics of wealth inequality and fallaciously infer, oh, see, there you go, boom, I proved it. Billionaires are keeping the world suppressed by their thumb simply because they're so wealthy, or because they're better at creating wealth than other people. Okay, so I want to talk now, now that we have some basic understanding of where already Jack Toohey's argument goes wrong, I want to go past Jack Toohey to Oxfam and Inequality Incorporated. Okay, as I already mentioned, Toohey has one source for this entire argument, for this entire slideshow. One source. That in and of itself, I think, is already a problem. It's a problem because it's already not an academic argument. It's not a scholarly argument, and I get that so many people are on both sides of every issue. In every world, there are just kind of two kinds of people: people who appreciate scholarly work and people who decry it. Okay, scholarship is good. Scholarship is a good thing. It is a great institution that helps us to understand the best arguments in any kind of field. Not that we should accept scholarship uncritically. Okay, I've written a whole piece where I think I go through in a very accessible way, some pretty painstaking detail, how most scholarship that is published is wrong, is false, is baloney. And yet at the same time, we don't reject scholarship as a result of that. So to make an argument about wealth inequality, which is such a complex issue, and to only use a source which isn't an academic source, that I think carries a lot of weight for people when they see it on Instagram, but it's really unconvincing in the end. I've already explained some other problems with it, but even just that alone shouldn't really convince anybody. You ought to ask yourself, okay, well, why should I take Oxfam's methodology? Now, to Oxfam's credit, and again, this is not, I'm not here to attack Oxfam and say everything Oxfam says is false, or that they're baloney or anything. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is they're not an academic source, and they're only producing their own studies by people who are already political activists in their organization. Oxfam is a political activist organization formed from multiple NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which were all themselves political activists, in order to produce research that seems to substantiate their policy agenda. Okay? Nothing wrong with that. And it doesn't mean that everything they said is false or anything like that. But let's understand that if I came to Jack Toohey or anybody else and I said, oh, here's Walgreens' report on how great Walgreens is, or how well Walgreens retailers are paid, and it's got methodology and statistics from a study by Walgreens, would anybody take seriously my argument if I based it entirely on a report from Walgreens? The answer is obviously no. In the same way, why should anybody be persuaded purely from Oxfam that billionaires are some evil cabal, right? Now, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on the document called Inequality Incorporated. And I will say, to Oxfam's credit, they published not only their study, but they also published an entire document on their methodology. And they cover in each section how they perform their methodology, how they arrive at the statistics they arrive at. Okay, so I thought for a while, maybe I'll go through the document and kind of harp about my issues on their methodology. I'm not going to do that because I realize that probably wouldn't be super valuable for people. And I don't think it really detracts from the point that I'm making, which is I think we can all accept, and I've read their methodology document. So I've seen the statistics that they published, and I've read the methodology. And I'm not even going to share all of their statistics, but I do want to focus on one section, which is more relevant to the point that I'm making broadly about Toohey. I think you can simply say, let's assume Oxfam is absolutely correct on everything it says. And I think you have some reasonable pushback on even their methodology. As transparent as that seems, there are some sections where they just simply say, oh, well, we outsource the statistics to this third-party firm, and then we perform some calculations which we don't care to show you in this section, which arrives at a number. But that being said, all in all, I didn't find almost anything in their statistics objectionable. So again, I'm not necessarily criticizing Oxfam or even the document. But here's, and you can go yourself. Go to oxfam.com. You can find Inequality Incorporated. It was published on January 15th of this month, or of this year. And you can even pick up it along with their methodology document and look for yourself. You don't have to trust me. You can just read it. It's pretty easy to read. So, but even if we accept all of the claims made by Oxfam, I think there's still room for concern and or even reasonable pushback on what Oxfam is arguing. And before I get there, I just want to show here are the claims made by Inequality Incorporated throughout the document. These aren't all of the statistics, but I pulled the first sort of 9 major claims or statistics that they use as evidence for their claims. And you'll see a lot of similarity with the ones that I showed you from Toohey. So you can see that he's just reciting a lot of these. But I'll go ahead and read through some of them. Again, the first one is about the 5 richest men doubling their wealth. 791 million workers have seen their wages fall or fail to keep up with inflation. You have billionaires are just, again, as a corporate group globally, billionaires are 34% richer than they were at the beginning of, quote unquote, this decade of crisis, with their wealth growing 3 times as fast as the rate of inflation. Number 3, despite representing only 21% of the world population, countries in the global north own 69% of global wealth and are home to 74% of the world's billionaire wealth. Number 4, globally, men own $105 trillion more wealth than women. Number 5, if the current trend continues, we'll see the first trillionaire in 10 years. Number 6, if each of the 5 wealthiest men were to spend $1 million daily, they would take 476 years to exhaust their combined wealth. And number 7, it would take 1,200 years for a female worker in the health and social sector to earn what a CEO in the biggest Fortune 100 companies earns on average in 1 year. Number 8, the richest 1% own 43%. We saw that in Toohey's. And number 9, a wealth tax on the world's millionaires and billionaires could generate basically just under $2 trillion each year. Okay, so these are the claims or various statistics. Some of them are claims, some of them are just statistics made by Oxfam in the document Inequality Incorporated. And this is the document that Toohey's basing his reasoning on. And I think he finds it very persuasive. And I think a lot of other people are going to just look at this and go, wow, that's so persuasive. And I sort of wish it were more persuasive, I guess. Here's the problem with this kind of argumentation, both at Toohey's level and Inequality Incorporated. There's really no distinction. So even if I push back one further layer from Toohey's post to Oxfam, I see the same problem. Number one, it's not scholarly. Only one source used. And I don't think Toohey, for example, even when he makes his argument, he's only using one source, and he doesn't have a great understanding, I would assume, of the methodology being used. And it's based on a fallacy. It's just based on a fallacious inference. Even if, again, let's assume all of the statistics that I just said were accurate. And I think you have good reason to doubt, for example, number 9. A wealth tax on the world's millionaires and billionaires could generate $2 trillion a year. Over and over and over again, we see that there's a huge difference between both the incidence of a tax and the statute of a tax and the predicted revenue of a tax and the actual revenue earned from a tax over and over and over again. For decades, the Congressional Budget Office in America produces estimates of how much tax revenue a tax or a policy program is going to have, and they always overestimate it because they never take into account how people are going to shift their behavior or what people will do in order to avoid a tax. And what's remarkable to me is that Toohey even acknowledges in the statistics that he cited that rich people are very good at avoiding taxes. And I'm going to get back to that in a second with respect to Toohey's purported solution to wealth inequality. But so just number 9, I think right off the bat, you have, without even looking at their methodology, you can go, well, how's that true? That's a really particular claim. One which has proven to be false and false and false at all of these other at all of these other times and in all of these other issues. So what good reason do we have to believe that if we just raise taxes on the world's millionaires and billionaires that we'll be better off? And even if we can raise $2 trillion, what does that matter? Is that necessarily better than the economic value produced by the world's millionaires and billionaires? So you have a lot of space for pushback. But, and here's the critical thing, let's say they're absolutely right. I'm willing to grant Oxfam 100% truth on everything they've just said. I will give it to them. I will grant them that inequality exists and that you could raise taxes on millionaires and billionaires, etc. What have they established? What have they established through these statistics other than differences, even wide, great differences in economic attributes, abilities, and wealth accumulation exist in the world? Okay, but what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything. Per se, not on its own, these statistics don't prove anything. Once again, it's not enough to simply identify a difference, a disparity, a problem even. And again, we could push back on whether it even is a problem. But let's even assume wealth inequality is a problem. Simply citing those statistics doesn't show us the nature of the cause of the problem or the nature of the solution thereof. So to make that point, I think, a little bit clearer, let's consider these statistics. I'm going to offer some statistics as well. The top 10 highest players, the highest paid basketball players in 2020 made collectively $371 million in that year, in 2020. The league average at the time was $7 million. And the minimum salary in the NBA was $582,000 for any basketball player. If somebody were going to say something like, yeah, well, that's fine, because, and I think to some extent, Jack Toohey would argue, and I think he does argue in some of the comments he makes to his audience, that that's fine. The top 10 highest paid basketball players are exploiting. They're part of an exploitative system, etc. Okay, but let's even rewind the clock back to a time when Jack Toohey himself admits things were fairer. There was a fairer balance back in the 1970s and 80s. So in 1975, Kareem earned the equivalent of nearly $3 million a year, while the average security guard at the NBA made $7,280 a year. By Toohey's logic, even in a time when the market was much fairer, this 65-time ratio that exists between Kareem and a security guard, we'd have to conclude, by Toohey's logic, by his inference, we're forced to conclude that Kareem, LeBron, Curry, and others make their money through exploitation because of the wide gap between various earners. There's wealth inequality between various players of the NBA. And that wealth inequality, according to Toohey's inference, must be caused through exploitation. So we'd be forced to admit something which I think most people are going to, at the very minimum, question. Like, really? Are we seriously suggesting that LeBron is really just as good of a basketball player as anybody else? But he is making money, or Kareem was really just as good of a basketball player in the 1970s, but he's just making more money because he's exploiting other basketball players. He's exploiting a system which allows him to make way more money than somebody else. That seems really doubtful. You'd have to offer really good justification, a great argument to show somebody why that's the case. And what I think is remarkable is I think Toohey, to some extent, does admit this. To some extent, again, even in his opening claim, and you don't want to be too over analytical on somebody who's just making a post, right? Like Toohey's not offering a logical argument, but he does say one can only be a billionaire through exploitation. And when somebody else in his audience questions, again, this is somebody I think is a genuine, sincerely asking, well, what about J.K. Rowling? She just authored books, and she's a billionaire. She seems to own the IP on her creation of Harry Potter, and she's made $1 billion from it. Who is she exploiting? I think Toohey kind of like flip-flops a little bit. At one point, he seems to acknowledge that, maybe it's possible for somebody to become a billionaire, but 99.9999999% of us never will, so why cater to those who are billionaires? Which I found a really disturbing response because, again, what does it matter if 99.9999999% of us never will be billionaires? Is that a problem in and of itself? You'd have to show, you'd have to make an argument for why that's a problem. You can't just say, oh, no, 99.99999999999% of us will not be NBA players. So should we regulate NBA players? And should I be able to, on a street basketball game, redistribute some of LeBron's dunks and add them to my score in some random game because, hey, this is ridiculous. I'm not allowed to be an NBA player. That's unfair, right? That's an obviously fallacious inference. To be a terrible conclusion to draw simply from the fact that I will not be a NBA player. Similarly, just because I will not be a billionaire does not mean that it's wrong that there are billionaires in the world or that they're somehow nefarious in their wealth creation. So I think he does kind of bite the bullet on that a little bit, which is to say that he makes an argument that nobody can make $1 billion or nobody can make grossly more than somebody else without exploitation or without being involved in a system of exploitation. So assuming that, here's the problem. Here's the problem with Toohey's response. At what point does inequality become a matter of exploitation? If the existence of inequality is the determinative proof that exploitation occurs, Kareem makes this much, janitor makes this much, determinative proof that that exploitation exists, and exploitation is the main driver of economic differences, then what about Toohey's wealth? What about anybody's wealth? I mean, at what point? So let's take Toohey, for example. Toohey says 99.9999999% of us will never be billionaires. So why cater to those who are? You could flip that around even in a more personal way, I think, to somebody like Toohey and say, Toohey, you live in Australia. You're a TikTok influencer. You make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, presumably. Even if you don't, by virtue of living in Australia, even if you were the poorest person, which he clearly is not, just based on his pages, you possess a level of wealth that the vast majority of the planet will never know in their lifetime. So why should we cater to you instead of to them? Why should we be concerned about billionaires making everybody in the world better when we can just take your wealth and give some of that to some poor African in North Africa? If that doesn't hold first, and that would be arguably easier because you don't have the same ability to avoid taxes and wealth regulations and confiscation, then we should do that before we go after the billionaires. There's no real, as far as I can tell, distinction between those arguments. Other than it seems more feasible for me as a government official to steal Toohey's wealth than to steal Donald Trump's wealth, or Jeff Bezos' wealth, or Elon Musk's wealth. So we might as well take the collective wealth of all the wealthiest nations' poorest and give it to the poorest nation's poorest, because those are the vast majority of people who will never experience the kind of wealth that Toohey himself enjoys. Would Toohey advocate for that? I don't know. I mean, it seems like that would have to be, he'd have to, in order to be consistent with his position. Because there is a massive difference between his wealth and the wealth of most of the poor of the world. And if the difference between my wealth and someone else's wealth isn't a result of exploitation, then at what scale does that wealth become exploitative? He seems to suggest in the post that it's at the level of billions, or perhaps many millions, right? But then the question just becomes, then what changes in that process to turn wealth creation into wealth exploitation? So if Toohey would argue, and I'm not sure he would, I would just genuinely ask him, should we take everything you own and redistribute it to the poorest people of the world in the international community, because there are no billionaires in Thailand? Okay? I mean, I don't know that, but there are obviously countries in this world that have no billionaires to do this on their own. So should we just take your wealth and redistribute it to the people? And if he would say yes, that's fine, because he would have to assume then all wealth creation is just wealth exploitation. But if there's a distinction between wealth creation and wealth exploitation, which I suspect he would draw, namely he doesn't think of himself as an exploiter. I know I certainly don't think I've gained any of my wealth at the exploitation of others. If that's what he would say, then what you'd have to then argue what changes. At what point, if somebody's $999 million wealthy, $999 million wealthy, and they get one more dollar, suddenly is that last dollar a matter of exploitation? Did they exploit? You know, the only way they could go from $999,999,999 is to exploit one more person for the next dollar. But before that point, they were not exploitative, or what? You know, if I go from being worth $1 million, which is now like practically middle class, and I go from that to $5 million, is that the scale at which exploitation occurs? And what changes, what process exists to go from merely creating wealth or merely gaining wealth through licit means to exploiting other people for wealth through illegitimate means? We have no answer to that. He simply doesn't give us an answer to that question. And then finally, here's a really, really important question at the heart of all of this, which Toohey also doesn't give us an answer to, which is, what do we mean by exploitation? Not only at what point does the process change, but what does that process look like? What is exploitation? What does it mean to gain wealth exploitatively? I want to share with you a quote from Thomas Aquinas, where he talks about this very thing in his seminal work, Basic Economics, in the 5th edition. He says, quote, "Usually those who decry exploitation make no serious attempt to define it. There would be no basis for objecting to this word if it were understood by all that it is simply a statement about someone's internal emotional reactions, rather than being presented as a statement about some fact in the external world." And again, at the heart of that quote, I think is the problem that I and many others on the more conservative side of this issue would see in the argument that Toohey is making, and the argument that Oxfam subsequently is making, which is to simply present a difference in the world as if it's like, and to say something like, oh, exploitation exists, as if it is a fact, some kind of fact about the external world, instead of being somebody's internal interpretation of data, which may or may not be correct. In fact, could be very horribly wrong. And if we shape, and here's the concern, if we shape policy decisions based on an internal emotional reaction to data in the world that is in reality fallacious and erroneous, then you can actually destroy very productive groups in the world. And I'm going to talk about P.T. Bauer in a second to, I think, further elucidate that. But that would be an essential problem one of the essential, that would be like kind of the third essential problem with Toohey's argument, which is that we don't even have a notion of what exploitation is. He simply assumes the term. And nowhere in either Oxfam, in the document of Oxfam that I could see, granted, it's definitely possible I could miss it, but nowhere that I saw in the document by Oxfam, or more importantly in Toohey's post that reached 200 plus thousand people, probably more than that, there's no definition of that. There's no explanation of how he makes sense of that. So the problem essentially boils down to this. Simply citing that inequality exists does not tell us anything about the nature of the inequality, its causes, or more importantly, its solutions. Now, speaking of solution, let's talk about Toohey's solution. Because remember, he concluded at the end of his post with this argument about, or this statement about, anytime somebody tells you can't have better healthcare, by which I assume he means free and cheaper healthcare, which is a loaded term in and of itself, public housing, education, etc. Anytime somebody tells you that, it's because the 1% stole it from you. Again, exploitation with no real description of how that's possible. And he doesn't deal with that with the questions that genuinely come out of his audience, which is really discouraging. I mean, the way that he interacted with people who were like, well, how does that work? And a lot of them I felt were people just genuinely who were on his side, who were asking for like, well, how would we explain this? And he was very dismissive and rude to these people because I don't think ultimately he's thought it through himself. He's just staked a moral existential claim on the basis of this data, and it's part of his identity, and he's not willing to think it through from just a reasonable standpoint. But I don't know, but that's just, I'm discouraged by the way that I think he dealt with these genuine questions. But according to him, the solution, and according to Oxfam, and this is how I know this is Toohey's solution, because Oxfam is very explicit about what the solution is to the wealth inequality problem, is greater government oversight. Greater government oversight and greater government regulation. That is the way forward out of this inequality problem. But this has some genuine and serious problems. It's not just a matter of rich people or free market capitalists debating against the obvious truth of Marxism or something like that. There are genuine, real problems that exist with these kinds of, frankly, naive solutions to what are perceived to be problems. Not even firmly established or defined problems. One of them would be that, again, these are just basic ones, not even representative of the kinds of problems you could find in economic literature from people who are on the left and right. But one of them would be, obviously, government regulation and oversight has increased in the last century. The whole 1980s deregulation narrative of the West simply doesn't work. If you want more information about that, I've written pieces about it in my Substack, Cato's Letters. You can go and find. I debunked this whole notion that in the 1980s, there was this like massive move to deregulate everything and cut taxes, and that's how all this inequality began. Okay, first of all, no. The inequality has been an increasing trend since before the 1980s, and at any rate, we'd still have to admit that we're more unequal today by Toohey's own logic, by the logic of access. In fact, they make this claim. They actually make this insane claim via the mouth of Bernie Sanders that at no time elsewhere in human history has inequality been more prevalent. So we're more unequal today than we were in the 1930s. And it's obvious that since the 1930s, government regulation and government oversight of the economy and the market has increased. Obviously, there will be people who disagree with me on that. But it's so, that is the, let me say this, that is the representative, I think it's fair to say that is representative of scholarly opinion. The vast majority of economists and political scientists will not deny that government regulation and oversight has increased alongside the increasing trend towards inequality. That's a real problem that somebody like Toohey or the scientists at Oxfam should have to explain before we continue to do the solution, which we've been doing since the late 1960s at the minimum in terms of welfare state, because there doesn't seem to be any cure. Ever since 1969, we've been increasing the welfare regulation and oversight in the United States alone, and inequality has skyrocketed over over that same period. That's a really big problem. The other I just think, philosophical problem that should be obvious to somebody like Toohey or anybody at Oxfam is that exploitation, quote unquote, is literally how the government must operate. If we define exploitation as taking something from somebody else without due gain or without due remuneration, that is literally how the government operates. So you're going to solve exploitation through exploitation, because the force of law is the government coming in, you've created some wealth, and now I'm taking it without due remuneration. Now, I get it. There's arguments like the benefits we get from public goods and etc. More than overcome the costs of it. Fair enough. That's an argument for people to have. But it isn't obvious, I think, for a lot of people, especially with regards to welfare economics, how simply redistributing the income is the solution, because that is literal exploitation. It's literally saying to somebody, you've done this, you've got this, you have this property, I'm giving you nothing in return, I'm taking it by the force of violence, on threat of your life. I'm going to take some of your property and give it to other people who did nothing to contribute to your having this property. Now, I get it. People can disagree about that. This is a wide debate. I understand. You might say, I understand the people at Toohey would respond, but the kinds of workers that are going to end up getting the money from a billionaire that we steal their money from, those are the people who gave them that money in the first place. But you haven't established that. So you can't justify your solution based on that notion, because you haven't gotten there. You haven't given us any evidence that that's actually the case. And then beyond that, you can't even solve a problem that you can't describe. Since we haven't defined and appropriately described the problem, you can't solve it. There is no solution to a problem which you can't even define. Again, social mobility is a huge element of this entire thing. Not only did you not discuss the causes of inequality, but you didn't even discuss an entire world of, in my opinion, underrepresented literature in the wealth inequality problem, which is social mobility. How is redistributing income going to solve social mobility? It doesn't. In fact, it creates social stasis, because everybody will ultimately be equal. There will be no social mobility, which is fine. Some people probably argue for that, but you need to incorporate these kinds of complex, difficult ideas into a solution that advocates for basically killing a bunch of people in order to take their money. So those would be, I guess, kind of the major problems I'd highlight just at a basic level. And then I'm also going to point to, I think, some even greater problems in the literature, in economic and historical economic literature and theoretical economic literature, okay? Before I get there, though, I want to conclude kind of my discussion of this whole thing with this. Here are areas of agreement between people I think are represented by me and people represented by Jack Toohey or Oxfam. Here are key areas of agreement, which I think are important to highlight. There is a problem. There is a problem. All right, let's not caricature the opposing sides of this debate, and let's not caricature the opposing sides of any debate, but we all agree there is a problem, okay? We may not all agree on what that problem is, but even if, like, for example, I would say there is a problem in wealth inequality. It isn't just a matter of pure differences, right? I think there is genuine inequality that is being created. I've argued a little bit, I've hinted at, I've alluded to problems that I think exist at the social mobility level. I think the persistence of wealth and the persistence in certain classes of wealth is a much bigger problem than a lot of conservatives are willing to admit. And I think it's changing rapidly. So we can no longer look at data from 40 years ago and say, see, the poor are readily becoming rich and the rich readily becoming poor. We have to look at data within the last 20 years. And that's just not really there so much right now. So I do think there is a real problem. I think inequality does exist as a result, primarily in my opinion, of social mobility. Let's not caricature each side. This goes both ways. You know, I think it's wrong for liberals to assume that the conservatives are arguing that there's just nothing wrong in the economy, or that there's just nothing wrong in politics right now, or that the rich don't have any ulterior motives, and that they're the best, they're like saints among society. That's not the conservative position. I don't even think that that's necessarily a correct characterization of the free market position. Okay, but and similarly, I don't think we should caricature liberal arguments as just being idiotic or being people who just don't understand economics, or people who don't understand the value that rich people create, or etc. That isn't what they're arguing per se. What they're arguing is that there's an entire system here that is being exploited, even inadvertently, by people, because it's being propped up by very wealthy and powerful people. Okay, so we can agree there is a problem. We can also agree exploitation exists. I want to go back to what Jack Toohey opened his post with. He said billionaires can only exist through exploitation of workers, and then he said exploitation of systems. Okay, I think that's an area, a profound area of agreement between conservatives and free market capitalists and people on the far left. I think that there could be huge common ground there. And I think at the scholarly level, there generally is huge common ground there. A lot of free market capitalists make almost the same argument that Jack Toohey is making, which is that billionaires tend to only exist, or there tends to be a proliferation of billionaires in societies where government becomes overly regulated, becomes overly powerful. Why? Because then it's possible for billionaires to protect, through coercive power of government, their profits and prevent other people from competing with them. Competition tends to equalize wealth alongside a distribution of economic aptitudes and intellectual aptitudes. At least that's, again, I think pretty representative of the mainstream scholarly opinion on how human capital works and wealth generation, etc. So conservatives and or free market capitalists can agree alongside Jack Toohey that exploitation does exist. It's very possible that billionaires like Jeff Bezos, in fact, I firmly believe billionaires like Jeff Bezos and the CEO of Microsoft, the CEO of Google, exploit people. They are making money through illicit means, money through a process that generally free market capitalists call cronyism, which is only possible, as Milton Friedman argued in the 1970s and 80s, through coercive power of government. That is why free market capitalists and conservatives often advocate for a less powerful, less interfering market force and a greater rule of general moral law. We should solidify a set of stable rules that tell people when you're committing a crime and not, and we should leave the government out of regulating markets, because precisely the committees that tend to regulate those markets tend to be stacked with lobbyists that are on the payroll of the kinds of companies that Jack Toohey admits are greedy and exploitative. How are we going to combat that? So the argument from the conservative side tends to be, let's get rid of that. Let's just eliminate the possibility for these kinds of billionaires to have coercive force. I'm going to get to that again in a second. And we agree, final third area of agreement, we agree that rampant, persistent, and pernicious wealth inequality can be a bad thing. Again, nobody's denying that wealth inequality can be bad, especially if it is large, persistent, and pernicious. It can be destabilizing, clearly, for everybody involved, whether there's exploitation or not. I think the classic example is the French Revolution. Okay, if you look at the French Revolution, whether or not, and I just quite frankly do think the aristocracy was exploitative, but whether or not it was, it doesn't matter. The perception of social mobility is often the problem. I mean, that's an argument I've also made elsewhere. That's not even social mobility. It's just the perception of social mobility that tends to be destabilizing. If people feel like they will be under the boot of an aristocracy for the rest of their life, they will rise up in revolution and kill everybody involved. And the French Revolution was terrible. It was absolutely horrible for everybody involved. It was worse. It made the poorest of the French society worse off, not better. And it led to a dictator coming in who reestablished a lot of the traditional kind of conservative institutions, including the monarchy, including the aristocracy. So let's be aware, especially conservatives, let's be aware that wealth inequality isn't totally reducible to just wealth differences. We have to be cognizant that even if the nature of wealth differences is licit, if it's perceived widely to be illicit, there's a serious problem in our society. We will lose social stability. So those are the three areas of agreement, okay? But the major problem here and the major question is, what is the cause and what is the solution? I want to offer a couple of just pointing to investigation. Again, I'm not going to do overly comprehensive analysis of this issue, but I just want to point to some other areas of questions for people like Jack Toohey or other people who may be persuaded by Jack Toohey. The world governments in total control $103 trillion in hard assets alone. Hard assets. Real assets, $103 trillion, according to the International Monetary Fund, that bulwark of small government thought. $75 trillion, according to the Boston Consulting Group, for a more conservative estimate. They claim that the most conservative estimates are about $75 billion in hard real assets controlled globally by world governments. Okay, that's to say nothing of the financial power of governments, which is essentially infinite, especially in the United States. The central bank of the United States is infinitely more powerful than all the billionaires in the world combined because they have an unlimited budget. They don't need to tie their wealth to real assets. They can have an endless liabilities side of their balance sheet because they can always just print more money. Okay? So this is to say nothing of their financial wealth, and it's to say nothing of their legislative power, which is the most real form of coercive power imaginable on planet Earth. You know, if a billionaire kills my family, I still have recourse to a court. Even in an unjust world, there's a chance that through the coercive power of government, I can get justice against the billionaire who killed my family. What justice is there against the government? If the court is the one executing my family unjustly, my only recourse to justice is to take up arms to match their coercive force. Okay, this is pretty basic stuff. The trend of certain kinds, this is point number 2, the trend of certain kinds of inequality in the last half century have followed the trend of greater administrative states. So if the solution is going to be greater government oversight and regulation, just look at the trend of certain kinds of inequality, like wealth inequality and racial division. They've followed trends of greater administrative states. They have not been inversely correlated. They've been correlated. So in conclusion, here are some things to point out because his argument is based on, well, let's just look at the evidence of how much billionaires control the world. Billionaires control 43% of financial assets. Okay, that pales in comparison to the kinds of financial assets world governments control. And world governments are staffed by people just as corruptible, just as greedy, just as pernicious, just as evil as billionaires. You'd have to show me why that's a solution. It's not obvious to anybody that that's a solution. And if your logic is, look at how much billionaires control, we don't want them ruling our lives, we need to take up arms against them, then that logic would apply even more so to governments because governments control infinitely more financial assets than billionaires do. There's no way the 5 richest men in this country can compete with the Federal Reserve Chairman. I understand there are differences there. Real differences. I'm not trying to settle the debate. I'm just pointing things out that I think should help people like Jack Toohey get to a more nuanced and sophisticated position so you can appropriately have this debate. Okay, in conclusion, I'm going to share with you just 2 quotes towards the beginning of a book. I have it right here. This is a book by P.T. Bauer. It's called Equality, the Third World, and Economic Delusion. Okay, it is a fairly accessible book. It's not terribly large. Written decades ago on this very question of economic inequality, and not just in a country, but between countries. So this would go to the broader claim of Oxfam about how the global north controls 70% of the wealth, etc. I want to share with you 2 quotes from his book. And it goes to, I think, the heart of the problem that Jack Toohey is expressing. And I want to leave you with these quotes, and then I'll recommend some further reading to help us see really what is the character of this debate at the scholarly level and what needs to be answered at the popular level and at the scholarly level if you're going to have this debate. Okay, here's P.T. Bauer, and he says this of people like Jack Toohey. An unfounded belief in the basic equality of people's economic faculties has colored the language of the wealth inequality discussion. If people are assumed to be equally endowed and motivated, then wide economic differences suggests that some undefined but malevolent force has perverted the course of events. Of course, people are not equally motivated and endowed in their economic attitudes and attributes, and this explains substantial economic differences between them in open societies. This discrepancy between the unfounded belief or assumption and reality may partly account for the almost universal practice of describing differences as inequalities. Difference is plainly the more appropriate expression, since it is neutral. It does not prejudge the issue, unlike the term inequality, which clearly suggests a situation that is unjust or otherwise objectionable. And then earlier in the book, he states the following: possession of wealth does not by itself confer such coercive power in this crucial sense. Indeed, those who are rich are vulnerable to envy and to criticisms founded on an unreasoning presumption in favor of economic equality. These attitudes have at times led to persecution and even destruction of productive or prosperous groups, often ethnic minorities. In an open society, income differences normally reflect the operation of voluntary arrangements. In such a society, the accumulation of wealth, especially great wealth, normally results from activities which extend the choices of others. I'm going to read that again. Which extend the choices of others, as is clear from the fortunes acquired in, say, mass retailing or the development of the motor car. Okay, that's not going to settle the debate, but I think P.T. Bauer's expression here is very representative of the scholarship. He's very much in lockstep with economists and economic historians from across the board of political perspectives. It's only extreme radical theorists that tend to disagree with the basic notion from the field that wealth is not created through exploitation. In fact, outside of a handful of radicals, I'd be stunned to find strong mainstream economists that are well published in the schools of economic thought that dominate the West that can offer an argument using the methodological tools of economics that wealth is created through exploitation. You know, I mean, they're out there. There is a debate here, no doubt, but it's not representative. It's not the mainstream argument. And so it needs to be overturned. It can't just be asserted. So here's my appeal. I'm going to end here now with my appeal. Can you see liberals, leftists, people like Jack Toohey, can you see how some of us look at the situation of wealth inequality and find the solution to be the reverse of what Toohey is suggesting? Can you see how it's reasonable that we look at the facts, the same data that you're looking at, the same problem, and we find the reverse to be a more compelling solution, namely that we should limit government, remove regulation and oversight, so as to create higher levels of social mobility so people can actually challenge billionaires in the marketplace? I agree with Toohey. Critically, I agree with Toohey. I want billionaires to have less power. But the largest coercive power in the world, and the one that they wield the most, is political power, not economic power. If we all accept that billionaires are unaffected by developments in tax law, why would we expect them to suddenly come under the yoke of government if their entire livelihood was under attack? That question needs to be answered. Government corruption, social mobility, and impediments to real wealth creation, to me, seem to be the more appropriate nature of the cause of wealth inequality. Things like government corruption and inflation. These are real attacks on, once recognized by the report published by Oxfam. These are real attacks on the everyday wealth of normal individuals that don't hurt the rich and powerful, and yet it's not billionaires who are creating inflation, at least not directly. It's the government. It's the very people you'd like to hand more power towards. these are the people that regularly and perniciously attack the wealth of the smaller man and make it harder for him to open businesses and generate wealth. So that's my appeal. Can you see that how that's reasonable, and not just assume these differences exist, therefore there's this is the obvious nature of them. Let's have peaceful, charitable conversations about it. Aiming for the truth. Can we aim for the truth? Can we agree on methodologies like reason and empirical science to help guide our discussions towards what is the best approximation of the truth? That's my goal. That's my goal for everybody. Okay. That's it. I'm just gonna wrap up by I'm gonna recommend some further books. For a beginner on this issue of wealth inequality, because I get a lot of questions on wealth inequality, and I tend not to write or talk about economics anymore so much because I'm more interested in the philosophy and theology world of my life. And since I don't make a lot of money, I tend to do what I like. But I do get a lot more questions on economics and markets and finance than I do on theology and philosophy, which is fine. And so sometimes people ask me, like, where do I go for wealth inequality? Like, if I wanted to do what you're talking about, not be convinced of a position, but be convinced of a methodology, where would I go? And I would recommend. I know he's a polemical writer, but he's really not that polemical. I think he's been forced into polemics. I would recommend the works of Thomas Sowell, and a great place to begin. A real beginner's introduction would be Social Justice Fallacies by Thomas Sowell. It's his latest book, came out earlier in 2023. And it's really just an overview of his life's work. If you want something a little bit more in depth with specific chapters on wealth inequality, I would recommend Applied Economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1. This is a fantastic book. It's one of my actual favorites by Thomas Sowell, and he gets into all kinds of things, including, I would in particular recommend Chapter 8, The Economic Development of Nations, where he will get into, he's a leading scholar in the causes of wealth disparities between nations. That was basically the majority of his scholarly work after he was done with children's intelligence. So he can't be ignored in that space. He cannot be ignored. He's got just decades of research on what is really the cause of the differences between nations and their wealth. For a bit more of an advanced look, I'd recommend just Basic Economics. It's a much larger book, but it covers a lot of things. And it's just far more in depth. So if you can get through it or you can afford the book, I would recommend that as well. And if you're a bit more of an advanced reader, but still a very, very beginner-friendly book. I mean, he wrote Basic Economics for a non-economic audience, an economically illiterate audience, to try and make them economically literate. And so in this book, I would recommend chapters 7, 9, 12, and 23. They all deal with questions about income inequality within a country, disparities between countries, etc. So in particular, chapters 7, 9, 12, and 23 would be great. Again, I would recommend P.T. Bauer's book, Equality, the Third World, and Economic Delusion. It is fantastic. I think it's my personal theory that Thomas Sowell builds a great deal off of P.T. Bauer. So those would be my introductory text for a more advanced, certainly an advanced treatment of the issue that goes into the economic theory. And again, I keep referencing the scholarship, what I think is represented in the scholarship. I would recommend Labor Economics by George Borjas. This is not a conservative economist. I mean, Borjas is not somebody out there who's like a free market capitalist or something. He advocates for planned economies, and well, not really planned economies, but for government oversight and so on. If you can get the book and you can understand it, if you have the mathematics background to understand an economics textbook, or you know, you can read economics, I would highly recommend this. If you're like really, really curious, what is the state of labor economics and scholarship on labor economics? How do economists in the mainstream, regardless of being liberal or conservative, political right or left, how do they understand issues like labor supply, human capital, the wage structure, and labor mobility? There are chapters devoted to each one of those issues in this book. It's a fantastic book. I'm here holding the 7th edition. You can also get the 8th edition, but I think the 7th edition is just fine. I have the 8th edition as well, but there's really not much of a difference. And then lastly, and just real quickly, I think it's important beyond just economic theory to understand, and again, I'm just answering this for people who kind of often ask me, how do you go about doing this? Like, how do you arrive at a position like the one you're at. I think it's important not just to remain in theory. I mean, I like to think of myself primarily a student of history. I do a lot of philosophy, I do a lot of theology, and I do a lot of economics. Less so on the economics front anymore. But I think of myself first and foremost as a historian. I once had a professor of history who said that the difference between philosophers and historians is that in the study of philosophy, you get to sort of tiptoe your way around the edges of controversial issues because you can think abstractly and conceptually about things and then superimpose what you believe through abstract reasoning to be the truth back on history, whereas a historian really has to get into the dark and dirty. I see this all the time in theology. I find it, this is a little side note, but I see it all the time in theology. I find, in particular, philosophic or scientific people who don't read history or don't like history as much tend to be really geared towards some of the more like confessional, liturgical expressions of Christianity or Christian theology, whereas people who are really grounded in history, like deeply, and put sort of history first and historical issues first and philosophical issues second, might be more magisterial, like reformers, Protestants, etc. That's just a broad characterization. It's just something I've noticed. But I'd say the same thing about economics. Like, it's one thing to talk about the mathematical structure of wages. It's another thing entirely to actually get into the history of the development of wealth. And this is something I think somebody like Toohey would have to contend with if you're really going to get into this debate. So I recommend two very easy to read books. These are not complicated books. These are popular level books, but they're great. The first one is by Edward Chancellor. It's called Devil Take the Hindmost. And it's a history of financial speculation in Western Europe and the United States. And it begins particularly in Western Europe. And I think somebody who's going to advocate for the kinds of problems that or for the kinds of solutions that Toohey is advocating for has to be able to contend with the record of history. It's not just a theoretical problem. We can historically document how people created their wealth and whether or not exploitation was used, etc. Again, I wrote a whole thing on Substack about this very distinction. People can hear all the time about the theory in economics that it's almost impossible for a natural monopoly to exist. A natural monopoly is like somebody who truly owns the market. Just through market forces, they come to dominate a market with no artificial help from the government, and therefore suppress the consumers. So they suppress competitors and oppress consumers through high prices, right? Mainstream economics basically has accepted that, yeah, these might exist, but they're very, very rare and they're very, very hard to exist. People, when they hear the logic of those theories, can accept it, but they're so convinced that historically U.S. steel really was a natural monopoly. It really was exploitative. So I wrote a whole piece on the history of it. If you actually explore the historical record of it, you can see quite plainly, no matter what people tell you, it was not a monopoly. It didn't suppress people. It didn't even gouge. It wasn't even a price gouger. There's lots of propaganda that runs through history that just doesn't meet the historical record. And then so lastly, I would recommend another similar book called Cronyism, Liberty versus Power in America. It's written by professor of history Patrick Newman, who's more like an anarcho-capitalist libertarian type. But as a historian, I found it very good. It's a very good book. And it covers, again, that nature of cronyism that I think is critical to a debate like the one Toohey wants to engage in. But he'd have to come to terms with why his solution for government control wouldn't just give us more of the same. Because ultimately, here's a history in America since 1607 that basically shows time and time again, every time financial interests get involved in the government, that's when things go bad. And that the best solution has been eliminating, through government power, the government's ability to get involved in markets. And there are other books I can recommend, but those would be, most of those are very beginner friendly, other than really labor economics. And P.T. Bauer's a little bit of a harder read. It's a little bit older of a book. So hopefully that's helpful. Sorry if it went really long, but I thought it was a very important thing to discuss. So hopefully I help you. Hopefully that answers some questions and or generates better questions and gives people the confidence to engage with people like Jack Toohey without being convinced by it. With seeing that persuasive rhetoric is not the same thing as good reasoning. So with that, I'll leave you. Have a great day, and thanks so much for listening.